Hello and welcome to the Future of the Euro Area COVID-19 Response and Recovery session today. My name is Danai Kyriakopoulou. I'm Chief Economist at OMFIF, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's session. It's a very important day for the EU, and we're very pleased to have the EU Commission represented here for the very first part of the session today. Unfortunately, Commissioner Gentiloni is presenting the plans as we speak, but we're very pleased to have in his stead Marco Abuti, Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the Commission. So thank you very much, Marco, and welcome. It's misleading that we still have Paolo's name in the webcam there, but welcome to you. It's great to have you with us. So as I was saying, the plan is something that was very long awaited. It's in many ways exceeded expectations looking at the first reactions to it, but a lot of details still to be ironed out, and we look forward to discussing these with you today. Before we start and go into the logistics and how the session will work, just as a warm up to all of you at the audience, we'll launch a poll to see what you think about Europe and the crisis. So Jean Monnet, one of the founders of the European Union, said that Europe is forged by crisis and also by the solutions that we prepare for them. And do you think that Europe will come stronger out of this crisis? Yes or no? And we'll ask this question now, and you can start giving your votes. And we'll also ask it at the end of the meeting to see whether your views have changed based on what you've heard from Marco and others in the panel. So while you take some time to start voting, just some words on logistics for today. So the meeting is on the record. It will be available on the OMFIF website after this. And we have a chat function on this platform. By now, you're hopefully all very up to speed with all the different media and platforms for online meetings. But there is a chat box where you can send questions to organizers and panelists, and that will then allow me to pose these questions to Marco in this session and also to moderators in other sessions to their panelists. You can also send through questions to enquiries@omfif.org if you prefer. So we look forward to having this as a very interactive session and to engage with you as much as possible. So let's put up the results of the poll before we move to the first part of the program with Marco. Let's see, what do you think? Will Europe come out stronger out of the current crisis, yes or no? Okay, so around 2/3 of you, just over around 2/3 think that it will come out stronger, and maybe the optimism is fueled by today's EU announcement. So that's a good platform for you to start then, Marco, and hopefully we'll get even higher after today's session. So over to you. We've seen a shock that has hit countries around Europe in different ways. Some have been hit harder than others. And it's a shock that is affecting everyone. We're seeing how interconnected the global economy is, the health sectors are, and we've now seeing today a big common response from the EU. We've seen the ECB act fast before. What is your initial remarks in terms of the crisis response that we've seen so far before we move to today's plans, and how you see the shock and the future of the euro?
Thank you very much, Dana. Nice to be here. Okay, I have to correct something because I was until a few months ago Director General for Economic Financial Affairs. Now I'm Chief of Staff of Paolo Gentiloni, so I'm, let's say, still an imperfect but closer substitute to the Commissioner than with my previous hat. Now, I think nice result of the polls. I was thinking precisely like you whether the polls have been taken yesterday or the day before, instead of this morning having the Commission unveiled, an important package, whether the result would have been different. Since we are in the polls mode, I would like to ask myself also one question to the audience. This is more difficult to do a poll on this, but maybe you can collect the feelings afterwards. And it is the question is, how will the current crisis be remembered in the future? I mean, we had the 1930s, the Great Depression. We had, after 2008, the Great Recession or the Great Financial Crisis. How would we dub this crisis here in the future? Now, my favorite definition of this is the great fragmentation. This is precisely something that we should fight against. And if we are successful, it would not be remembered as such, but there is a risk that that the current crisis produces these divergences and fragmentation. Now, I think to understand the logic of today's package and its rationale, we have to come to a reading of what is happening. I mean, this crisis here is an exogenous shock. It is a shock that is symmetric in nature and asymmetric in outcome, and it is a shock that has systemic features. Also, part is temporary, part is permanent, part is supply side, the part is demand side. Now, if it is exogenous, as it clearly is, then the typical arguments which have created a lot of divisions in the EU, which is those typically related to moral hazard. So basically having creative accentuated crisis because of policy misbehavior does not apply this time round. So this is important because one of the difficulties that we had in managing the crisis over the past 10 years has been the fact that we did not have an agreed narrative between member states. Those who saw it as fiscal misbehavior, those seeing it as lax financial regulations or sudden capital flow movements or other type of crisis. So this led to a disagreement and then acting only late as you know, in the so-called ultima ratio at the time. So I think if we have a better chance now to have a unified view, I think it is also easier to overcome the political obstacles in putting in place the package.
And do you think there is that unanimity in views these days? Because we've also seen some disagreement. We've seen some people saying that the state aid that some countries can afford to offer leads to an uneven playing field and disrupts the single market. We've also seen the reverse argument for the countries that are fiscally fortunate, saying, well, we fixed the roof when the sun was shining, and now we are rightly supporting our industries and our firms. But this may lead in the recovery phase to winners and losers. So it may not be as clear cut. Yes, the origins of the crisis are a textbook exogenous asymmetric shock, but how countries are responding to it is not as straightforward.
That obviously there are nuances here, but I think there is much more agreement than it has ever been on the fact that we need a common response. Then we have obviously, we see political constraints at the national level, but I think on the underlying view of the crisis, I think there is a very large agreement. And it is true that the different fiscal spaces have allowed different degrees of interventions in the economy. But I think even countries having more fiscal space and having been able to help more the enterprises, the private sector, the economy in general, they acknowledge that should this lead to a permanent impairment of the single market, everybody would be worse off. So this, I think, is an element that is important. The fact that we have had a fundamental change of views, a change of approach in Germany, not only by the government but also within the government. And we know that in certain episodes in the past, that has been difficult to maintain unity within the authorities in Germany. The fact that there has been a fundamental change of heart there is also due to the fact that something which leads to structural divergences is not sustainable over time in Europe. So I think this is important. it is important also the fact that the crisis is a systemic one. So a key definition today in the package is recovery and resilience. So it's a recovery and resilience facility, which is at the heart of this plan, which is called next EU generation. So which is I think is quite appealing title. So it's recovery and resilience, in which the recovery is part of the rebuilding now of equity repair, filling the large investment gaps, but also the resilience element. So making sure that we strengthen the fundamentals so that we move Europe into a different growth model in the future, which recovers, let's say, the agenda of the digital and environmental transition that the Commission has put forward in the first place.
Yes, we'll move to talk about the recovery plan, but just a question on this issue of resilience, and also of how you see the time horizon for recovery and resilience, because the next generation part of the plan has a time horizon of 2021 to 2024, whereas the MMF is obviously goes longer than that. How do you see this time horizon for the recovery? What is the outlook that the Commission is basing the plan on? And the resilience, you mentioned some very long-term issues as well: climate change, the digital transformation, the building of strategic investments, etc.
Yes, I mean, this is a temporary facility. So it is over the next years, with the bulk actually coming 21-22. So that is the real time horizon for delivery of the main bulk of the actions. There is some front loading also in the current year, but clearly this is limited by the fact that the system that we have put in place for raising funds in the future, which is based on borrowing on the part of the EU, requires an increase in the own resources ceiling, which requires unanimity and ratification in national parliaments. So we hope that clearly the urgency of the crisis will lead to a swift decision, but this can only come into into operation at the beginning of next year. So we are not going to be able to do that in the present juncture. In the present juncture, I recall we have already, in terms of financial resources, over 500 billion that have already been adopted. ESM, the SURE that is borrowing to help the short-term work schemes, and the ESM healthcare facility. So this is already up and running. Is up and running in the next few days. Actually, is the deadline.
Yes, and of course, we also have the ECB also providing some bridging support to the economy in the meantime. But I think the word that you used, hope, and when you were talking about it requiring unanimity is quite important, because of course this is not a done deal yet. It has to get approved by the member states. So how far do you think it is from what we will finally see actually being approved? Because we've already in the past few hours, when the announcement has happened, seen some comments in the press from representatives of the frugal four, as they're called: Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark, saying that the positions are still quite far apart behind the scenes, and it still needs to win the support of all the member states. So when you say hope, what's your level of confidence in this reaching agreement in its current state?
Look, I think we must be optimistic on this. The Commission is, and the President is presenting this in the European Parliament at this very moment. Having heard after her speech at the beginning the reaction of the main groups, there was a very, very strong support. And the European Parliament is the other side of the equation. It's not only the member states. So I think the Commission has put forward a package that is of certainly high ambition, but realistic compared to the extent of the crisis. And the European Council itself, when the leaders met on the 23rd of April, called for a response commensurate. That's what the word they use, commensurate to the extent and the depth of the crisis. So now we hope and we count on member states standing by their word in terms of a commensurate response, and the Commission, I think, has put forward a mix which is, as I said, ambitious. Nobody is going to lose from this. I mean, there is, if you have the time to look at it, there is also a technical, analytical document that accompanies the decision of the Commission on the estimate of the needs in terms of equity repair, in terms of investment gap, in terms of social needs, which actually justify very well what we have done. And I mean, I'm pretty confident that the discussion is not going to be straightforward. That is obvious. But the pressure of the crisis and the feeling that, in spite of the differences, we are in this together, I think is it's an important element politically.
What are also the arguments for these countries that are perhaps a bit more skeptical about the proposal, for them to become more warm towards it? You mentioned in the earlier part of our conversation that everyone stands to lose if we come out of this crisis weaker, and if certain member states come out of this crisis weaker in the single market. So apart from no one is going to lose out with this plan, what are the things that they can genuinely look forward to winning out of this plan? Because this is essentially what is going to make them to agree to it. So what are the strongest arguments in your view for those opposing?
Okay, I mean, there are several arguments. Okay, first of all, there is what the Commission has put forward today is a package with two big components. I mean, there is the recovery plan. So this 750 billion, which is split 2/3, 1/3 between grants and loans. Then there is the multi-year EU budget, which actually largely starts from the proposals that we had that was on the table of the European Council back in February, which was reasonably close to the also to the frugal four requests. So I think there is this element here. And then obviously is the second R of the recovery and resilience. That is important, because these proposals here will be anchored into the system of coordination, into the so-called EU semester. So the priorities identified there, they actually will strengthen the fundamentals that member states will have, so that we become stronger in the future. So Europe, the poll that you have seen today, 2/3, 1/3 stronger Europe, I would hope also that through this commitment device, which has the element of financial incentives together with the let's say accent on reforms, sustainability, and also quality of growth and sustainability of public finances, I think that would hopefully convince also the more frugal countries that they can support this. And on top of that, I mean, there is a lot for them as well. Here there is not any single member state that is left behind. And again, the European Council in April said we should focus the resources on those who have been most affected. That's what we are doing today.
Actually, on this, since we started talking about the recovery plan, could you tell us more on the technical aspects of it? For example, how are these EU-funded programs going to be decided? Who gets what? What will be the application process or the decision process of allocating these grants?
Now, okay, what we have is the following. I mean, there is an issue of where the money comes from. what are the priorities, what are the programs, and how this is going to pan out. Now, on the sources, I think this is one of the big innovations of the package. It is going to be borrowing by the EU, by the European Commission on the markets. So the European Commission will issue bonds up to 750 billion in the next few years. The long maturities, 2028 till 2058, so very long maturities. And these resources here will be used for in the proposal of the Commission, 500 basically for grants and 250 for loans. The part of this is allocated to member states to strengthen their their reforms and investment programs. Part of it is not going to be allocated per member states, and actually the money will be allocated according to the excellency of the proposals and the projects. So, so on the borrowing, because that's an important element, how does the EU borrow in the market? What is the underpinning of this borrowing? The proposal here is to lift the own resources ceiling. So it means how much money countries are committed in case of need to give to the European budget. So the gap between this ceiling here and the amount of payments. So this gap here is the guarantee that is used for the EU to go to borrow in the markets. Having the AAA, the EU budget, we are confident that we can raise money at very favorable conditions. Now,
and of course, there is also the commitment by the European Central Bank in the programs that it has issued to be able to be there and buy more debt. And there is a 50% issuer limit for the EU debt, which is higher than the individual countries' debt, which may also be tweaked for pandemic emergency program. To what extent, for example, here in the UK, we have seen a lot of coordination between the Treasury and the Bank of England, which those studying the economic and monetary union in the euro area are looking at with envy, perhaps. What extent do you think that that would be desirable also in the euro area to have more fiscal and monetary policy coordination? And how are these plans of borrowing and the bond buying that the ECB is doing supporting what you've just outlined?
Look, I think what is very clear here, it comes from the experience that we had in the past 10 years between of the financial crisis, is that I think there is unanimous support of this amongst in the community of economists and also policymakers to a very large extent. The ECB has been too much the only game in town. So we have overburdened the ECB, and we need, I think, for responding to such a large crisis, a fiscal leg to walk together with the monetary leg. Now, when it comes to the fiscal stance, we have seen over the past several years that simply allowing, trying to achieve the optimal fiscal stance simply via coordination national fiscal policies is inefficient. And in this particular case here, had they been left simply to the amount of fiscal space that the member states have, you would have a very, as I mentioned before, a very imbalanced element. So what we have added here, even though the plan is for the EU as a whole, not euro area specific, but we know that after the exit of the UK, in economic terms, EU is largely euro area dominated economy, at least in terms of size, relative size. What we have added here is an element of vertical coordination. So between member states' fiscal policies and fiscal policy at the EU level. So this, I think, is something that changes quite fundamentally the policy mix that we had in the during the financial crisis. This was very much linked to the on the shoulders of the ECB, much less on the fiscal side. Now with this, we have I think a much more balanced policy mix, which I think is a useful one. I tell you, my personal view for quite a long time has been that we would see some changes in the relation between fiscal and monetary policy once it would become very apparent that putting all the onus on the shoulders of Christine Lagarde, was very broad shoulders, but nonetheless, asking everything through the monetary authorities, when it would become apparent that the cost of doing so exceeds the benefit of that. Clearly, I think if you look at the Karlsruhe ruling of a couple of weeks ago, where I mean, the finger points a bit the ECB for in their view, having exceeded their mandate. This is not our view, obviously, but it means also that we would risk to get less into that type of dilemma should the fiscal leg carry more weight. So I think that's what we are trying to do today with a package which is a very sizable one, and able to rebalance with the policy mix.
Yes, no, absolutely, and I think that better fiscal monetary coordination is a big, has been a big disadvantage of the workings of the euro area so far. And I think if we manage to break through that, as you suggested, that will really shift the needle in the original poll question that we asked about Europe emerging stronger from this crisis, if what has happened very much at the national level and the fiscal lack of fiscal coordination is able to be coordinated better. Just to invite the audience to start sending your questions, we have around 10 to 15 minutes more with Marco. So if you have any questions for Marco, please put them through in the chat and I'll put them to him. But yes, on your point about the ECB being for the only game in town for too long, certainly the Karlsruhe ruling had an impact on this. David Marsh and I wrote a piece about this also on the OMFIF website about the very direct link between the GCC, the German Constitutional Court ruling, and the call from the German Finance Ministry to Christine Lagarde about being more conciliatory towards the Constitutional Court. And we still await to see what stance the ECB will take. We've seen the statement that they are still committed to their mandate, of course, which was a more strict initial response, but they still have the time to order response, not just from the Bundesbank, but from the wider ECB. On your point about how will this all be paid for, and you outlined the issue of the issuing the bonds, what about the taxation side? What do we expect to see there? And we still have some more time for that to be ironed out, but there will still be some differences in opinion there, perhaps, in terms of harmonizing the tax systems, etc. So is there more that you can tell us about that while the audience send their questions?
Look, if you look at the communication of today, there are two communications, one by the president on the overall strategy, one more specific on the package and the various components. You will see that the Commission calls also for putting in place new own resources to finance the budget. So they are outlined there as a possible options. There is no specific legislative proposal yet. We are still working on that. We will come back on that later on. By the way, the taxation portfolio is within the broader portfolio of Paolo Gentiloni, so we are going to be at the forefront of this. Germany has always highlighted in their approach that you need to have at the same level, let's say, spending power, spending capability, and the revenue side. So you cannot have a complete desynchronization of this. So I recall that the German presidency is going to be in the second half of this year, and there is in their intentions there is a lot on taxation, and we have we know now is a little bit dormant because of the crisis, but we have at the G7 and in particular the G20 level the whole issue of digital taxation. So we'll have to see how things pan out there. This is a possible source of own resources. We are pursuing a process at the global level with the under the OECD, but we have declared that the Europe is ready to take action in case we do not have an agreement at the OECD level materializing. So on the taxation side, I think this is going to be an important open chantier in the future. In the near
Thank
future.
you. We have some questions from the audience started to come in. So I have a question from Giovanni Caligari coming in on the 1 second. Yes, so Giovanni would like to know what it means for including some of the grant components into the European semester. Does this imply some sort of conditionality linked to the SGP of the country-specific recommendations?
Okay, I think this is an important, sensitive question. I know, I mean, considering Giovanni's nationality is particularly hotly debated there. How is it going to work? Let me outline it very briefly. Member states are asked to put forward recovery and resilience plans where they will outline their investment priorities and their reform priorities. These plans will be assessed by the European Commission. We are going to set out milestones for delivery of the member states, and there will be contribution in terms of grants and or loans for attached to the in tranches attached to the delivery of these milestones. So the president is very clear, does not like to talk about conditionality, which evokes I mean troika and program like IMF EU program of the financial crisis, but more agreeing on the priorities. What we are going to do all together is within the semester to agree on country-specific recommendations for the countries in terms of broad priorities, and the member states will articulate their priorities in these national plans. So we see the process very much bottom-up, coming from the member states precisely to ensure strong ownership of the on the part of the member states. I think this is also very much linked to some of the evidence in the literature where it is shown that reforms which are done, let's say under pressure and under external pressure, maybe they are implemented, but they are more easily reversed. So we very, very strongly put the emphasis on national ownership, so that the countries, deliver this and select the priority within the overall priorities of the semester.
Actually, linked to that, we have a question from David, OMFIF's David Marsh, about the practicalities of how the countries will execute this. So David is saying that countries will have to have project management skills, administrative apparatus to spend the money effectively. Do you think that this is adequate across the Union and for countries like Italy, for example?
Look, I think David is right that countries, they have to equip themselves to carry out these reforms and the investments in an effective manner. And in fact, I mean, if one looks at the country-specific recommendations, not so much of this year, because this year we have essentially focused on COVID-related responses. And in fact, I mean, if you look at the fiscal recommendation of this year, is the same for all countries in the EU. But if you go back to the past years, most countries, they have country-specific recommendation on reforms of public administration, precisely to deliver effectively. As part of this program here, there is also a strengthening of support of technical assistance that the Commission is actually ready to give to the Member States to equip themselves to make sure that they carry out these priorities in an effective manner. So we have tried to take an approach.
Is it an extra budget within the plan, or is that the existing technical?
It is within the plan. It is the plan. Well, obviously, it is not. It's not a huge budget because I mean, it's technical assistance, also favoring assistance from other sources, either consultants or the IMF or the World Bank. So that is it. But let's say we are ready to support, as we have done actually in the past several years with countries of the euro area in particular.
Okay, thank you. And we have two questions now more on the banking union and the capital markets union and how this all links. So one is from Arnab Das from Invesco, who is asking to what extent does the joint semi-federal approach represent a quid pro quo for a high degree of fiscal support in some major euro area economies that might contravene state aid rules? So this is something we talked about earlier, Marco, and also he's asking to what extent would the ERF complement the banking union in particular. And then we have a question which you may want to take together from Anna Gresti, who's an economist at the European Central Bank, that Anna is saying the recovery plan will also be an opportunity to reinforce and complete the capital markets union, question mark?
Yes, I think important question. We have, first of all, we have not forgotten at all the key priorities of completing capital market union and banking union. And actually, if you look at the communication of the president of today, which is an overarching chapeau communication to the whole plan, it is mentioned there that we will pursue banking union, capital markets union within a deeper economic and monetary union. We also mentioned in the more geo-strategic part, the international role of the euro, which, as we all know, as we have said many times, actually requires completing the architecture of EMU to be credible. By the way, on the international role of the euro, we know that the big advantage of the US is a very deep and very liquid treasury market that we do not have in Europe yet. The fact of issuing such a large amount of bonds at the European level, so 750, will allow also to create the, make sure we have all the maturity structure in the maturity curve of the EU instruments in place, so helping deepening the financial markets also. On banking union, things were started to move last year, at the beginning of this year. You remember the German proposal under Minister Scholz, which attempted to put more in parallel this risk sharing and risk reduction side. And one of the elements that we had in the back of our mind, actually, for this package here, was precisely to overcome the distinction here, which has been very, very poisonous, between creditors countries and debtors countries, between those favoring solidarity and risk sharing and those favoring responsibility and risk reduction. So we are going to go back to banking union. Obviously, for the moment, action has been elsewhere, but in the second part of the year, we will come back to that, and there is a work program of the Eurogroup, which we hope that would get more momentum once we have the fundamentals of this package under our belt. And very important also on capital markets union. On this, we have a high-level forum that has been appointed under the chairmanship of Thomas Wieser, and we are planning to have strategic plan capital market union 2.0 under the German presidency, most likely in the third quarter of this year. I think what this crisis shows is that these two priorities are absolutely, I think, essential. They become even more relevant in the light of the current crisis. Diversifying the sources of funding, I think access by the SMEs, not overburdening the banks. And if you take a little bit more of a medium to long-term perspective to capital markets union, difficult to believe that you can ensure the investments needed for the green transition and the digital transition through borrowing from banks. So there you will need capital markets much more developed in order to pursue this type of investment.
No, certainly items on the agenda that should not be set aside, but you raised the issue of the risk sharing versus risk reduction. To what extent do you think that there is more of a clarity now on the balance between these two? Because I have a question from the Deputy Governor from the Czech National Bank. You mentioned earlier about the benefits of now having fiscal coordination versus national fiscal policies, and Deputy Governor is asking, why is the coordination of national fiscal policies less efficient than an EU fiscal policy? To him, it's not so obvious. He's raising the issue of moral hazard, that the weaker countries will lose an incentive to consolidate their fiscal policy. So what do you say to the Deputy Governor from Czech National Bank on this?
Okay, I think, I mean, what we are living now, it is precisely, it shows precisely the insufficiency of horizontal coordination on national policies. Because under normal times, and how many times we have asked to Germany to spend more, those with fiscal space to use it, because we were, keenly aware that in the pre-crisis period, that would help also via the trade channel and demand to help also other to sustain demand in other countries, and also to rebalance the large imbalances especially within the Eurozone. So in normal circumstances, we have seen that, but we have during the crisis, we have to face a paradox, which was that those with fiscal space did not want to use it, and those without fiscal space, they were desperate to use what they did not have. So if you jump to today, leaving only to the national fiscal responses creates these unwelcome consequences in terms of the working of the financial markets, big divergences, which I think is completely undesirable and unsustainable, both economically but also politically. So if you have a central element which would help to take care, intervene, and be directed more sectors, areas, countries more affected, I think it would help to rebalance and to ensure more symmetry compared to the risk of grave fragmentation that I mentioned before. So in my view, the advantages of having a central element are overwhelming, and the allegation of moral hazard, I said before that it plays less of a role in this, but I can see the instincts are still there to read things throughout this channel. When I put the emphasis on the second R of the
resilience
and resilience, it is precisely to make sure that we have we recover conditions of well-functioning economies, structural reforms, and sound public finances, which allow to create in the future fiscal space out of this crisis.
Thank you, Marco. We have a lot of interesting questions coming through. I'll group a few together because they're about the mechanics of the fund. So We have a question from John Kornblum of Noer. Is there an agreed purpose for the funds, paying corona-linked costs or budgetary support in needy countries? So that's one question. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier. Then I have a question from Julian Callow of Element Capital. Why did the Commission opt for another 250 billion euros in loans on top of the Macron-Merkel proposal of the 500 billion in spending? Is there more detail about the profile for borrowing, so that we can understand the amount of redemption during the 2028 to 2058 horizon? And will the 750 billion delivered in tranches per semester? Would it be over 6 semesters, given that it's a triennial plan? And then a question from also on this issue, from Will Oswald from GIC Singapore. I'm still unclear from the earlier remarks on how the fund distribution will be determined. So Bloomberg reported up to 82 billion euros for grants for Italy and 91 billion for loans. So how will this be determined? These are the charts that the Bloomberg's Brussels team put together earlier.
Okay, I think very good questions. Some too early to answer. So I give you some elements, but it is clear that not all the answers can come today, not because we do not have them in principle, but because of the mechanics of this. Not everything can come immediately. Now, on the priorities for the Recovery and Resilience Fund, this is the as I say, it has two pillars. One is the reforms, another one is investment, linked to the priorities identified for the member states in the EU semester, and this codified in these plans, which is the Recovery and Resilience plans from the member states. So I cannot give you more specific priorities than this, precisely because we see this as a country-owned. So we expect the countries to put forward the priorities themselves. We will assess them on the adequacy of tackling the short-term as well as medium-term difficulties and bottlenecks in the countries. But this is, let's say, their general orientations. We do not want to, let's say, prejudge fully of the type of investment. On the, I think what Julian asking on the loans, yes, I think the bulk of this will be grants, and there is a part of loans also. I think I would not belittle the help of loans, because here these are loans of long with long maturities or very long maturities. So if one thinks in terms of present value, yeah, actually a quite substantial help for the member states, for those who can who borrow in the market now at conditions which are less favorable than would the EU with a AAA borrow in the markets. Now, on the allocation, there are two types of allocations per country. One is on the grants. On the grants, I think here the allocation key, which is going to be, by the way, obviously have to be discussed with the member states in the council. So we'll have to see whether the proposal of the Commission is supported. But I think we have done a good job here. We are taking parameters which is in part historical and in part forward-looking. The historical parameters are related to GDP per capita. They are related to unemployment, with a particular emphasis on youth unemployment, with some capping in this. What is very interesting is that, having tried many different keys for the allocation, actually, and it's very telling also for the future, is that historical parameters actually correlate pretty strongly with real-time or future-oriented parameters. So countries which have been more affected are also those who were less resilient in the first place. So the resilience which is captured by more historical parameters actually is a good predictor for the future exposure to the shock. So this is the what we have done on the bulk of the recovery and the resilient facility. And then there is a part which is about between 50 and 60 billion, which is strengthening of the structural funds for regions, and also here we take more specifically the delta. So the changes here with quite a bit of allocation going to countries more exposed by Italy, Spain, and some other countries. So the loans are not compulsory; they are voluntary. So countries can decide to apply for loans. But as I said, I think it can be pretty interesting if you compute in terms of present value. I think this is largely on. Yes, I think there will be disbursement in tranches on the specific maturity, these or elements which will need to be put in place in the future. There is no decision on this yet.
Thank you very much, Marco. A lot of interesting questions, a lot of open questions still for the future. If we will see this be the final plan, or if there will be more compromise, still a lot of hearts to be won in this, but we wish you the best of luck. Thank you for your time today. And thank you also to the audience for questions, still some that we haven't answered. Will the rating of the EU bonds be affected, given that the horizon is starts in the next budgetary cycle of 2028? But that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, and good luck. I'll hand over now to my colleague David Marsh, who will take us through the first panel of the day.
Thanks a lot.
Good. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Danai. Thanks for kicking us off there. There's some real good headline news here. So we're going to cover this now in a very speedy hour-long session. We've slightly extended this. I know Joachim Nagel has got to leave in about 3/4 of an hour, so I'm going to advance you in the order, Joachim, somewhat. We have speaking to us Ashok Bhatia, who's the director in the European office of the International Monetary Fund. He's going to be speaking first, and then Joachim will come second. He's part of the board for international matters at KfW, the German promotional bank and development bank, and will be going to the Bank for International Settlements later this year to take over as the deputy head of their banking department. Once a central banker, always a central banker. Joachim was at the Bundesbank previously. Thirdly, we will have Didier Borowski, who's the head of global views at Amundi. Amundi are working with us on this conference. Thank you very much, Didier, to you and your colleagues for your support. And then Riccardo Barbieri, who's a man that we're all thinking about, who is the Director General in the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Italy. First of all, though, Ashok, everybody's got only a short time, basically, to answer a few questions, a maximum 5 minutes, if you don't mind. Is this the answer to the IMF's dream? Because you've been calling for more fiscal activism in Europe for years and years and years. And are you now supremely happy with all this? Because as we have just heard, this can be the answer to prevent the ECB from being the only game in town, as Marco told us. And then secondly, linked to that, will this actually overcome this major demon of fragmentation?
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. Firstly, on today's announcement, clearly it is a very major one. We have colleagues looking through the fine print. I think I should reserve judgment on the detail, and clearly there's a lot for finance ministers and heads of state and government to talk about in the coming weeks, many details to be ironed out. But yes, overwhelmingly, the direction of travel is positive. I think we at the fund have been consistently impressed with the European policy response to this unprecedented crisis, both at the national and at the joint level. If you permit, I will very quickly go back to a few months ago to make a few points. I think my central point is that this whole crisis has been an enormous learning experience from the get-go, and importantly, will continue to be. I think when I recall late February, March, when we at the fund were starting to hammer out our World Economic Outlook projections, which were, of course, released in mid-April. Frankly, there was a certain leap involved in moving from a traditional mode where we fine-tune our projections by a decimal point here or there to one where one was walloping the numbers by 3-5 percentage points at a time. So I think one had to come to grips with the idea that this whole, business of shutting down entire economies by administrative decree was an entirely new animal. As you would know, we came out with a projection of a 7.5% contraction in output for the euro area this year, followed by...
What is that now, Ashok? Because you've clearly scrolled forward a great deal now. And then can you address this question of fragmentation? It looks as though different countries are going to be performing at very different rates, particularly as they come out of the crisis. That was the major point that Marco was making.
Yes,
so
no, this is
indeed what your pronouncements are now, please. How have you changed forecasts?
We are working on revised forecasts to be released on the 24th of June. I think our managing director has already gone public saying that speaking at the global level, revisions are highly likely to be downwards. Looking at the euro area, there are many countries where the growth outturns in Q1 fell short of what we had assumed. So we'll be, but not in all countries. So we'll be having a careful look. But I think two things one will be looking at are, one, the depth of the trough, and two, the speed of the recovery, and whether this assumption of an essentially V-shaped recovery is going to hold or not. So, I think premised on the sort of projection...
Ashok,
yes.
Surely the V-shaped recovery is not going to hold. Surely we can be certain about that, can't we? We don't have to wait until the 24th of June, do we, for that?
Yeah, I heard someone yesterday saying maybe we will have a Nike swoosh shaped recovery. So yes, clearly it's a matter of degree. But I think my point was going to be, if one is looking at a more protracted crisis, then increasing, the longer the crisis is, the more attention will have to rotate to questions of whether the sort of fiscal support one has seen at the national level is sustainable, whether it needs to be sort of made more targeted over time, and how one would triage and decide, which...
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off on that, but that's very good as an introduction. Thanks very much, Ashok. Could I go over to Joachim, because this point about fragmentation and also the V-shaped or not, we had a session at the KfW on the 27th of February, if you remember, when you said then it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. That was now more than 2 months ago. So what is your outlook now for the euro area as a whole? And then can you address this issue of fragmentation, which is a major problem, as Marco just told us? And then secondly, linked to that, the German Constitutional Court, which you are clearly very knowledgeable about, having been at the Bundesbank. Is it correct to say, as Marco says, that without the 5th of May verdict, we may not have had this quite a big U-turn by Angela Merkel leading now to the Franco-German plan?
Thank you very much, David, for your question. I think regarding which size or which kind of recovery we will see, I guess it will definitely not be a V-shaped situation. This is clear. I think we shouldn't talk about that anymore. I guess now what the European Union today decided could maybe help to more or less make the recovery a little bit more relaxed, but at the end it will be a very bumpy road out of that pandemic situation. And I was surprised when Michael said, well, if we label this situation, then he would come to the conclusion that it is the great fragmentation. I'm surprised because I have the opinion that that this fragmentation was already there before the crisis, and he alluded to the capital market union, and he was exactly right when he said this should be one of the major projects, at least for the German presidency this year, to get along, to do a better capital market union, to reduce fragmentation in the future. So I believe if something is coming good out of that crisis, then it gives us a better understanding that we have to bring that European Union much closer to the point where we have to reduce fragmentation. Taking your second question and coming back to the German court ruling, and I'm definitely not a legal expert, but what I would like to do is to start maybe with a good part out of that court decision, because that court decision was related to the public sector purchase program. So the decision does not directly harm the legality of the current pandemic emergency purchase program of the Eurosystem. However, the impact of the court decision goes, I think, much beyond what I just said. The reasons for their decision, which the judges gave, are much more worrying. The decision to take maybe the 5 pillars of that decision, where firstly the volume of the purchase is limited from the beginning of the restrictive program. Secondly, the 33% issue limit is observed. Thirdly, purchases are in line with the capital key. Fourthly, a minimum credit quality is necessary for the purchased assets. And fifthly, purchases must be continued if not necessary to achieve the inflation target. To make it crystal clear, the current PEP program of the Eurosystem does not meet these criteria and could therefore again end in the German courts. And as I said, I'm not a legal expert, and the ECB has not been obliged to follow the German court ruling. But for the Bundesbank, definitely it is a different situation. And just take the whatever it takes in July 2012. Another whatever it takes for the ECB is in the future, in my interpretation, after that Supreme Court ruling in Germany, much more complicated. And that makes definitely the things not easier for the.
Thank you. Let's leave it at that. I think that's very helpful what you said, and that clearly has had some political impact. We cannot tell. We cannot read Angela Merkel's mind. I want to go on to Didier Borowski now in a similar vein, if I may, Didier. You have talked a lot about how Europe progresses by crises, using the famous phrase of Jean Monnet. Is this now really, are we on the cusp of something really big for Europe that could actually change behaviors, change performance, change the way we raise taxes, change the way that we look at Europe? Can Europe grow into a United States of Europe as a result of this decision that we've heard today from the European Commission? I think you're on mute at the moment, Didier. Could you just switch yourself on to so we can hear you, please? You're looking very compelling, but we can't hear what you're saying. Yeah. If not, while Didier sorts himself out, we'll go over to Ricardo, and Didier, we'll sort you out. Ricardo, Italy is in everybody's minds, clearly, because Italy has been under pressure on the financial markets. Do you buy what Marco said about fragmentation? Joachim said we've had that here already. But it looks, Ricardo, as though Germany is going to come out of this rather more quickly than, say, Spain or France or Italy. I've just been listening to Axel Weber, the boss of UBS, who of course used to be at the Bundesbank as well, saying that Europe is well behind the United States and Asia in terms of recovery. Do you think that's true? And where do you think Italy fits into the recovery profile?
I guess he's also on mute.
Yes. Ricardo, can you?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, loud and clear. And then Didier will come over to you in a moment. Sorry that you were momentarily cut off. So Ricardo, you heard my question, I'm sure.
Sure. I think in the short run, probably the most important variable is really the timing of the epidemic, when each country had to impose control measures, social distancing, and the impact that had on the economy. We saw that already from the first quarter data on GDP, where France and Spain had a sharper contraction than Germany. And we know in Germany that there were only some restrictions on the production, on the productive sectors of the economy during the month of March, later than in other European countries. So the short term, I think the short term performance depends also on how efficient countries have been at controlling the epidemic and then timing the reopening of the economy. Like if you look at the latest Italian figures, we now have around 500 people in intensive care, 500 patients. And the whole, all the projections had been targeted around 4,000 figure. So in some respects, one can say perhaps we overshot. We controlled even too much the epidemic. I'm slightly frustrated that Italy was on the front pages when the number of cases was going up, but not many people have emphasized how successful Italy has been in bringing down those numbers.
No,
I
think we do recognize that. We do recognize that you're coming out of it. What about the economic effects? So as you do come out.
So the economic effects, because this recession is about, how much or for how long you keep the economy shut down. It's not an economic process per se. It's not driven by financial considerations. Those can come as a second round effect of the crisis. So economic performance in the short run will depend principally on the length, on the duration of the period for which you kept certain parts of the economy closed and you imposed measures of social distancing. But then the interesting question is, how do we get out of this? And I think in finding an answer to that, you need to look at how the crisis affects different sectors of the economy. What were the conditions before the crisis? And how important the sectors that are most impacted are to each economy. For example, there's no denying that the transportation sector is hugely impacted by this crisis. So if a country is a major manufacturer of aircraft, if a country is a major car manufacturer, they will be impacted from an industrial point of view in a very significant way. And also, I think a key factor would be how much we focus or we shift our resources towards investment, towards adaptation to the new reality without perhaps overstating the changes, because many things will go back to the way they were before the crisis, but others will change. And I think one of the things we are seeing is the huge success we've had in working remotely. In having schooling done remotely, but that highlights that if our broadband, was even more widespread, if we brought fiber everywhere across our countries, if we revamped our transportation infrastructure, then we could decongest the urban centers, bring back people to the countryside, have a much more balanced overall spread of the population in each country and reduce pollution. So these are fascinating things.
That's very good. And we will get back to those future industries, I know, in a moment. I'd just like to go over to Didier now. And I put that very large point to you, Didier, which I know you were starting to issue some response to, but we couldn't hear. So can you tell us what your response is? The United States of Europe, is that now on the cards for us?
We're not there yet, as it was mentioned previously. The fiscal answer that was given today was done at the EU level, not at the Eurozone level. So it's not still, we are not still, I would say, in an optimal currency area. But having said that, the glass is gradually filling up. My point is that we have, by nature, in the Eurozone, given that we have several countries, we have had different fiscal answers. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the policy mix in the Eurozone, it is not as flexible as it is in a perfect monetary union, like I would say the United States. Just if you want to make a comparison, the United States, you have had a very quick fiscal answer, and the Federal Reserve makes a very strong commitment to monetize that at the end of the day. And you have already a fiscal plan, which is put on the table by the Democrats, which is around 14% of GDP. Republicans remain very strongly opposed to it. But at the end of the day, if there is a compromise, you have an explicit commitment from the Federal Reserve to monetize this debt. Well, we're not there yet in the Eurozone because we wanted until recently to issue at the country level. So now it's all about, how to share and to increase the risk sharing mechanism that we have in the Eurozone, and to build a true monetary union with a fiscal answer that is credible. And we are not there yet. It will take time. My point is that what has been attempted.
Didier, sorry to interrupt, but could I just break into you there and just ask you a point which came up from Marco Abuti and also the audience is putting, from your point of view, financial markets point of view, what would be the right mix between the monetary side, the European Central Bank elements of the bond buying and so on, and the fiscal side, whether through the new 750 billion or the 500 billion from the ESM or the Shore? What is the balance for you? And are you still fairly confident that the ECB will need to increase the PEPP program when the Monetary Policy Committee meets on the 4th of June?
So for sure, the answer has to be made by the ECB. We expect the PEPP from the ECB to be very flexible, both in time and in terms of composition. That was basically the message also that was given by several key ECB members over the past few days, either François Gallo in France or this morning by Isabel Schnabel. So despite the German court ruling, in fact, at the end of the day, the ECB intends to keep the maximum flexibility of its program. And I think it's the key in the short run for my financial markets, because the key to avoid fragmentation both on credit markets and on sovereign debt is to have a central bank that has a very strong commitment to do whatever it takes to avoid, rising tensions. And on this, we are clearly reassured by the recent communication made by key member states. We do believe that the ECB will remain very flexible. It will increase its PEPP, but perhaps not with an envelope which will be given to markets, on the 4th of June. It can be an open line, and that's very reassuring.
I know several of you want to answer that question. Ashok, again, the question to you: what is the right balance? And I will come on to Joachim as well. I know he wants to answer that question. Ashok, what's the right balance between all these different tools that we have now? We have the European fiscal tools and we have the monetary tools. The ECB is there in the short term. You would agree, surely, that it's not good to rely too much on what Marcus called the broad shoulders of Christine Lagarde.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I'm not going to go so far as to sort of put some numerical answer on the table, $1 trillion from the ECB and $1 trillion from the fiscal authorities. I won't do that. But we are confident that this, despite the legal issues that have arisen, the ECB will find a way to continue to do what's needed within its mandate. I would also just factually observe that if one extrapolates the asset purchase pace we've seen the ECB implement in recent months, at some point it may indeed need to expand its envelopes. On the fiscal side, I think, I'd really like to emphasize the cup being half full. It is no small achievement that we've managed to put in place, a Sure table, aimed at households, an EIB element aimed at corporates, the ESM element aimed at funding support for sovereigns, and now a grant element. So I think a lot of this is coming together. It's a process, not an event, and no doubt these discussions will continue.
Yes, thank you. Joachim, you wanted to come back on that. You said already that we can't expect another do what it takes moment. We've got a question also from Julian Callow from Element Capital. Given the 5 criteria that you carefully mentioned, could you elaborate some more on how that might restrict the Bundesbank's ability to participate fully in the PEPP. And then I think you had a point anyway, what I was asking about the possibility of raising the amount on the 4th of June.
Maybe, David, coming back to what you asked to the group, I think your question is, in my understanding, wrong, because there's not that understanding that I have that we should discuss if the ECB should take a certain amount or the European Union should do something. I think they are totally different mandates. And the ECB, the Eurosystem, has the responsibility for 19 countries, and the EU has a little bit, has a kind of larger responsibility, and the mandate is completely different. So I believe what we heard today from the European Union, I guess this is an important step forward to give maybe the ECB a little bit more leeway in their in what they do in the future. So I think this is an important decision here, but should be seen in an independent understanding, because these are independent institutions, and especially this is the power of a central bank to be independent. Coming back to what the German court decided, I guess, as I said, well, it makes the things not easier for the future. This is clear, because as I try to allude to, the Bundesbank is more or less in the role to look very carefully what the Supreme Court decided here, and what they have to do to explain what the Eurosystem is doing to the German Parliament, and vice versa, maybe back then in the communication with the ECB. So I believe that makes things more complicated. But I also believe, after I read today what Mrs. Schnabel said in the interview she gave, I think, in the Financial Times, that makes me confident that there is also an understanding on the ECB side how they can help to overcome this obstacle. And I see there a lot of responsibility on the ECB side, and therefore that makes me also very positive for the future.
Yes, let's go back now to Ricardo. There's another question from the audience saying that there is a report today, Ricardo, saying that Italy would be able to obtain, under the new European Union proposal, 82 billion in grants and 91 billion in loans, or it may be the other way around. Anyway, some very specific figures. Are those the kind of numbers that Italy is actually expecting? And then, more importantly, can you actually mobilize those amounts of money in a meaningful way? Because you do need maybe to get better administrative apparatus and better capability to spend the money in an effective fashion.
You're on mute, Ricardo.
Yes, again, you are speaking very meaningfully,
okay,
but we can't
so,
hear you. Yeah, there we are. Thank you.
The amount you mentioned is significant. Obviously, it will be over a period of time, over several years. I don't think that the borrowing plans of Italy have been based on an expectation of a given figure. Obviously, these funds, the debate we are having is about how we should use these funds. And I'm in favor of trying to direct these funds as much as possible towards investment. Because I think we have already extended a huge safety net to the economy with the 3 different pieces of legislation that the government has issued. They're worth 4.5% of GDP. The amount of guarantees is huge. Credit that's protected or guaranteed is 780 billion euros in total. So I think at this point we really need to focus on investment. And going back to the ECB, and without prejudging what the ECB will decide, we know that the existing QE program is already around 10% of euro area GDP. That means if countries have borrowing requirements in the region of 10% of GDP, essentially this year the call on the market is close to 0. So that provides a strong underpinning to the bond markets in the short run. I think it's incumbent upon us, it's the Italian government that needs to have a clear plan of growing the economy and at the same time pursuing, as the European Commission recommended, a prudent fiscal policy over the coming years to make that credible. And I think at that point, the markets will stop obsessing about the specific debt to GDP ratio, also bearing in mind that if we take the number at the end of last year, we had a debt ratio of 134.8%, but the debt held by the market, so to say, was around 110% of GDP. So the central bank or the Euro system is now playing a very important role. Of course, it's an independent decision. They may in the future sell back some of their bond holdings, but in the short run, the presence of the central bank in the market is extremely significant. So I would say if our program is credible in terms of the likely impact on the economy, if we are able to raise the investment rate of the economy, then I'm hopeful that we can resolve this issue of being always, the whipping boy of the European bond markets and gain confidence among investors, and most importantly, pay a much tighter spread over Germany.
Well, I'm going to ask you that. Just a quick question on that. Where would you like the spread to be? Because you've often said that spreads of 200 or more are not in line with reality. It's come down a bit to slightly less than 200. Would 100, 120, a bit more in line with, say, Portugal or Spain? Would that suit you? Is that what you have got in mind, Ricardo?
Well, it would be, I shouldn't target any specific country because obviously fundamentals differ. My Spanish friends could say Spain has a much lower debt to GDP ratio than Italy, but we know that until 2016, Spain and Italy traded at similar spreads, and for some time, Italy traded through Spain. I think that's a realistic target for the short run. It would already mean a point lower compared to what we saw recently. And then I think the medium to long-term goal should be for Italy to catch up with the rest of Europe, obviously, except Germany and the Netherlands that have much lower debt to GDP ratios.
Good. I think that's a very fair answer, Ricardo. I don't think you can say much more than that. Ashraf, I've got a question to you from the audience, but we can also put it to others as well. Giovanni Caligari, who asks, is the Recovery Fund now introducing an EU-wide insurance tool against future adverse shock? Don't forget, at the moment, it's supposed to be just a temporary program, although we hear that the debt will run until 2058. And he asks, could this EU borrowing, in your mind, Ashraf, be used again in case of future shocks? So it become a real structural tool. I appreciate you can't speak for the EU, but with your economist hat on from the IMF perspective, would it be good if that became a permanent mechanism?
It would. 2 years ago, we put out a paper at the fund with a proposal for a euro area central fiscal capacity. And one of the premises there was that indeed, in a monetary union, it would be desirable to have some sort of a central fiscal instrument for macroeconomic smoothing. So if in today's proposal is the seed germ for something for the euro area that could be maintained into the future steady state, that would be positive.
Good. Joachim, can I put that question to you? Because Germany habitually has been against too much centralization of EU budgets. Also, the famous euro bonds, something that Mrs. Merkel said she would only accept over her dead body. She obviously didn't mean that literally. Do you think the German public opinion, which has become actually more euro-friendly, shall we say, in the last few months, do you think they're now ready to accept this quite big U-turn that Mrs. Merkel is now suggesting as a result of the crisis?
I think, David, this is an important point you just mentioned. I think this was also my impression over the last couple of months, that the public opinion in Germany really became more European friendly. I think this is a good development out of that pandemic. Coming back to your question, if that new let me say, fund or that money that should be used to mitigate the pandemic effects in the European Union should be a permanent instrument for the future. I guess it could be this kind of a permanent instrument, but I believe as a conditio sine qua non, we should work on a real fiscal union. We should work on a real capital market union. I think this is also important to achieve in the future, let me say, a good effect out of these instruments. I think it does not help just to come up with the money, 750 billion euros, 500 billion grants out of that. I guess the effect is it's very much dependent on how these instruments could be used in a less fragmented environment. And this is still a long way to go. And I hope that the President of the European Union, it was my understanding, she had before the crisis, this is still on the agenda. I guess this is a very important point here.
And a question for you, Didier Borowski. Hopefully you're now on unmute. A question from the audience, which is tailor-made for you about the taxation side of this. If this is going to become truly Hamiltonian, then we will need to have a tax raising capability. And now the ideas have been put forward by the President of the European Commission today in terms of taxes on digital economy, taxes on carbon and so on. This looks like pretty heavy duty taxation. Question from John Orchard, the CEO of ONFIF. He says, if the EU raises taxes, for example, on big tech, might this then have unintended consequences and encourage these entities to go offshore, thus damaging the European economy?
We probably need in the long run a common tax if we want to have some common fiscal tool. But at the end of the day, there is nobody wants a pro-cyclical fiscal policy at this stage. Raising taxes is clearly not something that is in the pipeline in the short run. So coming back to the initial question, you have basically two kinds of fragmentation currently. The financial and the market fragmentation, and the ECB is there to deal with the financial fragmentation, and you have the economic fragmentation. And at the end of the day, you need fiscal policy to deal with economic fragmentation, and we need, when we have that kind of symmetric shock, exogenous shock with an asymmetric impact, we deal some kind of a risk-sharing mechanism. But at the end of the day, I guess that also it's a common knowledge that when we face that kind of shocks, even if you can imagine in the long run some, taxation, at the end of the day, what we need for the coming 2 years is a fiscal policy that will be very counter-cyclical in nature. And that's, I would say, what we need to keep in mind following the announcement.
Thank you. I've got a question now for Ricardo, and I'm going to put one last question to Joachim. He has to leave probably in about 5 minutes, and so you'll get a question, and then we'll go on until 1:45. The question to you, Ricardo, is tailor-made to you, and it's from Orhel Schubert, who's from the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Why does Italy not use the ESM loans at 0.1% interest, but borrows instead in the markets at 1.4%, so wasting around 1.6 billion euros of much needed funds? Question to you, Ricardo.
I can give you my personal view because I don't run public debt management.
No.
A few days ago, indeed, the Italian government borrowed with one bond issue around 1% of GDP with an inflation linker called BTP Italy. And it was marketed as funding for the emergency measures. And the response of Italian retail investors was huge. The average size of what was allotted was a bit lower than normal, and the number of people who bought the bond was higher. So the response was very strong. It was, in a way, I guess, also an issue of diversification of funding and also of showing what can be done. In other words, that with the appropriate marketing, a little bit of earmarking of what's being borrowed to the emergency measures, the response was very strong. Now, obviously, the
These
ESM is
are
there
presumably,
available.
you've got a lot of very rich people in Italy, and maybe they're feeling slightly guilty that they've not paid enough taxes, and so they're subscribing to
That's
these
a
loans.
bit of a cliche, if you forgive me, but I've lived for 20 years in the UK and now 5 in Italy. My observation on the ground is that the differences between the two countries are very limited in the area of taxation and tax evasion. From direct experience,
there is a point.
loans.
There is a point. When there's an emergency, people do actually act in a very patriotic way, and so that could be helping, couldn't it?
Well, last year we had a 1.6% of GDP budget deficit because we outperformed in terms of tax revenue by more than 10 billion. And that's because of technology and political changes, policy changes. It's not because of the crisis. It happened in 2019. So as I said, I think, it's frustrating that much as we Italians internally are the most critical you can imagine of our country, at the same time, we keep these sort of cliches about the country, which are not always aligned with reality. And as I said, I think Italy has done very well in this crisis, not only because of the response of the population, but because of how the health authorities at the national level, and I stress not in Lombardy, have run the response to the crisis. But a final word on the issue of the ESM. Frankly, I think it's also a political issue. As you know, the ratification of the changes to the ESM treaty is a difficult political issue in Italy, particularly because the Five-Star Movement initially opposed it. And so for this government, it is difficult to go to the ESM. And perhaps at this point, it's also giving a message that we are under pressure when in fact we are not. Obviously, in all honesty, we have to admit that the interventions of the ECB have been very helpful. But the fact remains at the moment, perhaps on cost considerations, the ESM loan would make sense, but otherwise there's no strong reason to go to the ESM.
No, thank you for that very full answer. Final question to you, Joachim, before you have to leave, and this is very much geared to the KfW. In the UK, the Bank of England is thinking about what to do on guarantees on loans when they come off after a certain period of time, and yet some specific company debt may still be distressed. What happens to the KfW loans, which are partly guaranteed for companies who may still be in some difficulty after the guarantee runs out? Have you got a way forward for that at the KfW?
I think so far the experience, and I guess it has, this is sure, a lot to do with the fiscal leeway Germany had and what was more or less the outcome of the famous Black Zero. But up till now, the experience we made at KfW with these loans is really very good. So the demand regarding these loans are high. So we have currently, just to give you here a number, it's now going up more than 40 billion euros. So it's really a huge package for the German companies and for the SME sector. And Germany is much dependent on the SME sector. And we did a survey at KfW, and so the coronavirus has hit Germany SMEs with 4. So the turnover losses in March alone amounted up to 75 billion euros, and more than 2 million small and medium-sized enterprises have been negatively affected, and half of the SME cash reserves will be depleted by the end of this month. So this is really a huge impact for the German economy. And so I guess the program of the German government to have a combination of grants and loans and the famous Kurzarbeitergeld, so the short-term workers allowance, this package, I guess, was rather favorable to mitigate all the negative things that came out of that crisis in maybe to really address this economic dimension of the crisis.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask the panelists a few more questions about the future, but I've got one more about guarantees. which is going to be for Ricardo. We're going to run on until 1:45, somewhat later than we thought, because I wanted to allow a full hour. So there's still time for questions. I'm going to then hand over to Ellie Groves, who's got 1 or 2 questions, a polling question
I have
for
to
the
say
audience.
goodbye.
Good.
Goodbye
Well,
to
thank you
all
very
of
much, Joachim, for taking part, and good luck with the KfW and all those loan guarantees, and look forward to speaking to you soon. And keep well and safe for you and all your family. So, Ricardo, a question to you about the capital set aside by the government for the 780 billion euros in loan guarantees. We know that loan guarantees do play a big role in the Italian government program. Can you tell us about the amount of capital that you set aside for that?
There have been different separate decisions. Some of them, as I think I mentioned earlier, the 750 billion that has been widely mentioned is the total of credit that is preserved or guaranteed. And a significant share of that was just what I would call a portfolio constraint on banks. For instance, with the first law decree, the so-called Cure Italy, there was close to 220 billion of loans to small and medium firms that banks were not allowed to reduce. So they were existing credit lines, partly unused, and that was based on a data set from the Bank of Italy. The Bank of Italy obviously had data both on the total amount of the credit lines and on the used part of those credit lines. And essentially the law decree says the banks cannot cut those credit lines until the end of September, also including the unused part of the credit line. And on that unused part, the government extended a guarantee, a partial guarantee. Okay. And then with a subsequent law decree, also with that law decree, the government raised the funds for the Central Guarantee Fund for loans to small and medium firms. Later on, it extended guarantees to a company called SACE, which is part of CDP, the long-term credit bank of the government, which normally guarantees export loans. And SACE was also redirected to lend to small and medium firms, and the government extended guarantees to SACE itself for that purpose. 200 billion for loans to enterprises, including small and medium firms, and 200 for export loans. With the latest law decree, the government also added further resources to this so-called central fund for small and medium firms. So it recapitalized it so it can extend further loans to small and medium firms. So the overall figure, in terms of the budgetary impact, is in the order of a few billion, because in some cases it was necessary to set aside funds as so-called standardized guarantees, which normally require the government to post, say, 8% of the amount of the guarantee as the budget hit of those guarantees. But clearly the hope and the expectation is that those guarantees would not be activated, and
I see.
This mechanism of maintaining credit to the economy, which incidentally led to a reversal of the ongoing decline in bank lending to non-financial corporations. In March, we had positive year-over-year growth in bank lending to non-financial corporations, with credit extension being maintained. The expectation and the goal, obviously, is to prevent companies from failing because of lack of liquidity, lack of bank.
That does seem to be a very constructive idea, and that does seem to be one of the success stories in Italy so far. I've got another question now on banking coming in from the audience. I'm going to put this to Didier Borowski, and then I've got a question to you, Jacques, and there'll still be time, I hope, for a couple of questions after that before Ellie takes over and asks the audience a question. So for you, Didier, 2 questions from the audience. One is that the European Banking Authority's chief Kamper has suggested that the EU recovery fund could be used to capitalize a precautionary bank capitalization plan, a kind of TARP style. Would that be a good use of the recovery fund money, do you think? And then secondly, Marco earlier on, a question from Denai suggested that the ECB could buy some of the bonds that are going to be issued by the EU. She noticed that the limit is 50%, not the 33%. Is that, in your view, likely? Because that would underpin this enormous amount of borrowing that we're intending to see from the European Commission in the next 3 or 4 years. Those two questions for you, Didier.
So first question, the good news for the Euro Recovery Fund is clearly to, I would say, anchor growth expectations for the coming years. And at the end of the day, the Euro Recovery Fund has to target investment, has to target the real economy. That's basically the way it should act. So that we will see basically the details, but my point is that you have a big economic fragmentation with certain countries which have been hugely impacted, and we need now to direct the help to these countries or to very specific sectors. Regarding the banking sector, I would say it's another story. The ECB has specific tools to help banks, and we would expect, in fact, the ECB to continue, in fact, to help corporations if needed in this environment. But I think the recovery fund is clearly to help with the economic fragmentation that we are seeing currently.
Okay, it could be a bit of a distraction. What about the ECB buying some of those European Commission bonds?
Yes, for sure. At the end of the day, what we need is that the joint debt that will be issued at the end of the day will be bought by the ECB. So that's clearly the way it should work in a normal monetary union. So we expect indeed at the end of the day that it will be part of the ECB purchase program to buy these bonds, and probably the ECB will keep these bonds for a very long period of time in its balance sheet. And that's also something very important to understand, if you want, because at the end of the day, we understand that these funds will have to be reimbursed. But just keep in mind that it will be in the long term, and that there is always a possibility in the coming years and in the coming decade for the ECB to roll over maturing debts. So my point is that that's clearly something which is good news if the ECB can buy these bonds.
Yes, and very much related to this, Ashok, two questions for you. Firstly, is Europe now moving to what you might call a more normal position under which states can issue debt directly to the central bank on the primary markets without having to go through the elaborate subterfuge of doing it on the secondary market? We do see this to a certain extent in the United States and in Britain, as well as in Japan, where there's a taboo on monetary financing in this part of the world up to now. Could that be overcome? And secondly, linked to that question that John Kornblum asks from the United States, he says the national debts receive grades from the rating agency. Presumably the EU debt will be rated, and in fact already is. You surely expect a AAA rating for the European Commission debt, but can you tell us how the European Commission will have to act in order to safeguard that rating in the future? I can see you're not speaking for the European Commission here, but again, your viewpoint from the IMF point of view would be extremely helpful.
Forgive me, the first part was?
The first part was basically about the whether monetary financing will be permitted at some stage in Europe, just as it is tacitly in other countries which are actually state-like, which the EU, of course, is not yet.
Well, I think for the first part, I can certainly offer you a clear answer, which is no. I mean, not only is the ECB's mandate clearly defined in the treaties, but as an additional safeguard, there is the absolute prohibition on monetary financing. I don't know if there's even been subterfuge. I mean, there's been a lot of checking over the years to make sure that secondary market purchases are not substantively having the same effect as primary market purchases. So no, I don't see that happening. And if anything, the German court has reminded us that there is a continued need for national and EU laws to coexist harmoniously. So I don't see that coming. In terms of how best to safeguard the rating on EU debt, well, I mean, as with any other rating, it will be a function of the revenue flows that support it, and therefore it ties into a lot of complex issues that will have to be discussed as we go through this proposal. If I may quickly just offer one factoid, which speaks more to previous questions. I thought it was very striking to see yesterday that 47% of the state aid approved in the EU is by and from Germany. So I'm just throwing that in to bring you back to your fragmentation point, and clearly some pockets are much deeper than others.
Yes, well, the Germans have had a fairly lax attitude towards regulations that they themselves don't always uphold. So that is an issue that we do need to look at. We're starting to run out of time. I wanted to ask a few future-orientated questions, and I would like to put one about the future industry in Europe. But first of all, Riccardo, a quick point from another member of the audience. Does Italy now start to see the green shoots of taxation revenue starting to flow in at slightly better levels now that you have eased the lockdown? Is it still too early to say whether you can see some uptick in taxation?
Well, we have data on digital invoicing, which are daily data, but personally I've only seen the numbers for the week between the end of April, beginning of May, and there was an improvement, but there are also working day effects. So we need a bit more evidence over the coming days to confirm that there is an improvement. We have seen from data on production and consumption of electric power, which are daily figures, that demand, so consumption is up quite significantly. One big user is still down, which is the railways, because the number of trains, of journeys has been cut and is not yet back to normal. But if you exclude the railways, there's clear evidence that economic activity is picking up. And we also see it anecdotally in day-to-day life. It's almost back to normal in terms of traffic levels and the number of people in the streets, obviously observing distancing, but it's a huge difference compared to last month.
Well, thank you. That's a bit more upbeat. We'll come back to you maybe in a month or 6 weeks' time and ask you how things are going then. I've just got time for two very quick questions now before we must close. One will go to you, Didier, and the final one, a more visionary question to you, Ashok. Very quickly, Didier, how will the money get paid back that's going to be raised by this new fund, the 750 billion? You can certainly increase taxes, perhaps, but we heard that's not perhaps the right moment to do that. Does it mean that the budget ceilings have to go up? And there you need to get agreement from all the countries in the 27. How likely do you think that is, Didier? Very quick answer, please.
I think it will be dealt with in the long run. I mean, it's a long run issue. I understand that from a political standpoint, they have to say that debts will be repaid. But my own guess is that against this backdrop, these debts will be long-term debts that will probably be rolled over by the ECB for a long period of time. And there is after the political debate on how to raise money in the Eurozone, but I think it's a question that will come once the situation has stabilized and we have still a few years to come to deal with this issue.
It might well be the daughter, it might be the, yeah, please, I was going to say it might be the daughter of Madame Lagarde that's coping with this at the ECB in the year 2058. Riccardo, quick answer from you, and then last question to Ashok.
Yes, very quickly. Today's communication from the Commission makes it clear that the proposal is to increase own resources, the ceiling on own resources, to 2% of GDP. So it's a very significant increase, which doesn't mean that the budget goes up to 2% of GDP. The proposed budget is 1.1 trillion over the next 7 years. But the member states would be committed, if necessary, to raise the resources, which means own resources means some taxes have to be earmarked to financing the EU budget. As you know, at the moment, it's mostly parts of VAT revenue that go towards financing the own resources. And the Commission talks about other things, about the tax on the giants of the web and the reform of corporate taxation that's in the works at the OECD. It talks about the ETS, so the system of selling pollution rights, and it talks about the carbon adjustment tax and other forms of energy taxes. So some of those taxes will be in principle earmarked, which doesn't mean that the budget goes up by an equivalent amount.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a good answer to our questioner in the Netherlands, who's worried about maybe higher taxes. Ashok, I wanted to end on a more forward-looking note. Ricardo made the point early on about how we're getting used to Zoom technology, future-orientated industries. There's going to be all kinds of industries in Europe that will do well out of this crisis, a lot that will suffer, of course. It's a question that we could occupy ourselves with for a whole hour, but just very, very quickly, where do you see the industries in Europe that are going to do well out of this crisis?
This comes back in a sense to the point I was making at the outset, which is, you know, a lot of the policies put in place have presupposed a deep but short crisis liquidity support to firms to get us across the ravine. But indeed, if this proves to be a longer crisis, attention will turn to not just providing liquidity support, but potentially solvency support, and that in turn will raise difficult questions of who to support and who not to. Part of the answer, of course, is a function of how firms and sectors were doing before the crisis and not wanting to support zombies, to use that awful term. But a lot of it will indeed be a function of which sectors can thrive in a more socially distanced world. I'm thinking to a tail risk.
Well, there we are. You're talking about things like the hygiene industry, certainly the remote networking industry, and certainly medical science and anything to do with science. One would have thought that could be the answer. And I know that in Italy, for example, you've got some excellent companies in that area, and I think that could be a salvation for us all. So I'd like to end on that more upbeat note. We've had a very full, more than an hour of conversation building on what Mark Abuti was talking about, and some very useful views about the monetary fiscal balance and what the ECB will be doing and so on. I'm going to hand over now to Ellie, who's got a question for the audience before she then takes us in to a final session. I'm not sure whether there will be a pause now, but over to you, Ellie, to conduct us through to the final hour and a quarter. Over to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for both listening in and joining as speakers. We really do appreciate it. So we have a quick poll question before I'm going to say that what I'll do is I'll leave this up for 3 minutes, so all of the attendees can go and refresh your water glasses, quickly make a swift cup of coffee. In that time, please, thank you very much to the panelists. Please do keep on listening, but take off your videos, and for the second panel, please pop your videos on while we do that. So the poll question is, do you think the EU recovery package is a Hamiltonian moment and a meaningful step towards euro area fiscal integration? So that is for audience members to ask, which will pop up in 1 moment. I will just open it. There we go. So please do start your answers, and we will be coming back at 5:02. So thank you.